Okay, in this second video, we're going to talk about federal policies for renewable energy in the United States. As you remember from the previous lecture, there are 5 energy use sectors in the United States, and 4 of those are what we call end-use sectors. The 2 most important sectors are the electricity generating sector, and the second most important one is the transportation sector. One thing to take into account is that every time these sectors use electricity, they generate greenhouse gases, and so they contribute to warming the planet. What has the federal government done to make sure that these greenhouse emissions are curbed? I'm going to talk first about what the federal government did in regards to the electricity generating sector. The Obama administration passed this thing called the Clean Power Plan. The Clean Power Plan was basically a rule that the EPA came up with that asked states to transition from coal electricity generation to natural gas, and then in a second step to go from natural gas to renewable sources of energy. The plan gave states a number of years to accomplish this goal, and it was considered the cornerstone of the U.S. commitment to reduce greenhouse gases under the Paris Agreement, which was signed in 2015. Now, the Trump administration announced that they were going to roll it back, and this is something that Trump campaigned on in 2016. And finally, in November of 2019, Secretary Pompeo announced on Twitter that the U.S. would begin the formal process of withdrawing from the Paris Agreement. So Trump's EPA rolled back the Clean Power Plan, and that's in the books now. Let's talk a little bit about what happens with transportation. Again, the Obama's EPA and the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration created these fuel efficiency standards to basically make cars more efficient in the US. The standards feature an average annual increase in efficiency of about 5% each year. And the idea here was to reach a fuel efficiency average of about 47 miles per gallon by 2025. The Trump administration's EPA rolled back these standards and created the Safer, Affordable Fuel Efficiency Vehicles Rule. That's called SAFE, and that happened in March of 2020. This rule basically contains an increase in efficiency as well. It's just that that increase in efficiency is lower. It's about 1.5%. So basically, the federal government has come up with ways of curbing greenhouse gases from both the electricity generating sector and the transportation sector. But in the last 4 years, there's been systematic efforts by the Trump administration to roll back those efforts. What I'm going to do now is focus a little bit on solar energy and wind energy, because these are the 2 most important sources of renewable energy that are going to be part of the energy portfolio of the United States in decades to come. I'm going to start with solar energy. So what you can see in this graph is that solar energy has been increasingly becoming more and more important in terms of the U.S. electricity generating capacity additions. And this, by the way, comes from the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, all this information. You'll see that in terms of how much solar has been adding every year, that number keeps growing. It's currently at about 40%. This is for the first half of 2020, but this is forecasted to keep growing, basically this dark blue portion of the bar chart. Natural gas is currently about 37% in terms of capacity addition, and then you'll see wind, it's pretty important, and then other sources is minor. So what you don't see here is coal, for instance. Coal is not adding new capacity, and that's because coal is being pushed out of the energy mix more and more. Okay, let's see about installation of solar panels in the United States. What this graph shows you is that there's overall a pretty clear increase in the number of solar panels that have been installed in terms of the capacity for electricity generation that they have. You'll also notice that most of these bars is this gray portion of them, right? Which basically means that most of the new solar panels or the solar capacity that is being added by utilities, by companies that generate electricity. Residential additions are also growing, and you see this dark blue here. That's residential addition of solar panels, but it's not growing as much as it's growing with utilities. The other thing that I want you to see is that there's a policy here in 2015. What is this thing called the ITC? It's called the Investment Tax Credit. As its name indicates, a tax credit that was created by the Energy Policy Act, which was passed in 2005 and it was implemented in 2006. Originally, this was a 30% tax credit for solar systems on residential and commercial properties. So if you, for instance, bought solar panels and you installed them at home, you would get a 30% tax credit for those installations that would come out of your income tax to give people an incentive to adopt these new technologies. Currently, the investment tax credit is at 26%. And you'll see that when it was extended in 2015, there was a big jump from 2015 to 2016 of installation of solar panels, and it's kept going up, right? For 2021, the tax credit goes down to 22%. For 2022, it goes down to 10% for commercial and utility scale and 0% for residential panels. A lot of people that favor the adoption of renewable energy sources complain about the fact that the tax credit keeps going down and that in 2022 it actually goes down to 0% for residential panels, and claim that this is a failure of the Trump administration to have actually considered to extend this tax credit. But actually this is a failure of Congress, which has the capacity to extend these tax credits. Moving forward, regarding solar energy, Biden has promised to reform and extend clean energy tax credits as part of his plan to transition to a carbon-free economy by 2035. But to achieve that goal, we would need to get about 100 gigawatts of solar energy added every year. And currently, we are about 20 gigabytes, or gigawatts. So we need to get going, and even extending these tax credits probably wouldn't be enough to get to that huge increase in capacity that we need to add from solar, wind, and other renewable sources. The Republican Party doesn't have a party platform in 2020. It just adopted the platform that it had in 2016. So there's not an official position regarding solar energy, and President Trump hasn't really shown much love for solar energy. And as a result of that, the policies from the federal government in the last 4 years have been sort of inconsistent. So for instance, I'll give you an example. In 2018, all imported solar panels were taxed at about 30%. And then in June of 2019, bifacial modules received a full exemption from the tariffs. Bifacial modules are those that capture solar energy from both sides of a panel. And this is actually something that public utilities lobbied for because they needed to import these bifacial modules to keep transitioning to solar production. And those tariffs were getting on the way of that. So in June of 2019, these bifacial modules received a full exemption from the tariffs, so utilities could keep importing them, buying them from other countries that produce them. Then in October 2019, the tariff exemption for bifacial modules was first revoked. And then in December of 2019, the U.S. Court of International Trade stepped in and reinstated the exemption. And then in April of 2020, the U.S. State Representative, which is an agency that is part of the Executive Office of the President, again removed the tariff exemption for bifacial modules. So now they are taxed again. So you can see all this back and forth in terms of policy that for a lot of people that are regulated by the federal government seems like a problem, because you have a change of the rules back and forth that makes planning more difficult for these companies, for the utilities, right? And let's talk now a little bit about wind energy. What you see in these two graphs is that first to the left, wind capacity has been growing continuously through the years. In 2020, we are at about 110,000 megawatts of operating wind capacity in the US. And to the right, you can see the effect that adopting wind energy sources has on reducing carbon dioxide emissions. Obviously, the more wind energy you generate, the fewer greenhouse gases you produce, because it's just a cleaner source of energy. This map shows you the share of state electricity generation that comes from wind. And you'll see that in some states, like for instance, Oklahoma, Texas, Iowa, etc., a big chunk of the generation of electricity in the state comes from wind. This is the map for 2019, by the way. If I showed you the map for 2018, you would see that these numbers are all, in every single case, lower. So for instance, Ohio went from about 1% to 1.7% of generation through wind energy sources. And to embrace wind energy production, the federal government has this thing called the production tax credit. This is a tax credit of about 1 to 2 cents per kilowatt hour for the first 10 years of electricity generation for utility scale wind. So basically, when utilities decide to build these turbines and have the windmills and produce electricity with them, they get a little tax credit per unit of energy production. In December of 2019, last year, Congress passed extensions of the production tax credit. And as a result, the current wind energy production tax credit was extended through 2020. Now, we don't have an extension for this production tax credit for 2021 and beyond, which, again, is problematic for a lot of people. This table basically shows you the estimated allowable tax credit by when construction of the infrastructure begins, right? And you'll see that this has been going down from 2016 to 2019, and then in this last year, it's grown to 1.5 cents per kilowatt hour. But again, this is going away in 2021. Moving forward for wind, we know that wind energy is becoming cheaper to produce, but investments in transmission infrastructure need to happen quickly. Even a Republican-controlled Senate could promote more wind energy production and transmission, because a lot of the capacity for wind production is in states that are controlled by the GOP, such as Texas, Oklahoma, Iowa, and Kansas. Now, President Trump is not a big fan of wind either, but he'll probably not be able to stop the market forces moving in the direction of sustaining more wind energy production. I don't know if you remember the debates, if you saw the debates between President Trump and Vice President Biden, but basically, President Trump argues that wind-based generation is not that great. It has a lot of environmental impacts. I think the statement was something like, it kills all the birds, which is incorrect, but that's what he said. So he hasn't been a big fan of it. But at the same time, you can tell that we are moving in the direction of more and more wind and solar production, and there's little that a single person can do to stall that progress, even though for sure there's enough power in the executive office of the president to slow down that process. And that's what's happened in the last 4 years. Questions you should be able to answer. How did the Obama administration act in regard to electricity generation from renewable energy sources? And how did the Trump administration respond? Number 2, what are the trends in solar and wind energy production? And number 3, what are some of the policy tools that the federal government can use to promote renewable energy sources? And I'm talking about the tax credits that I mentioned in this lecture here in particular. That's it for this one. I'll see you in the next one. Thanks.